Continuing in chapter 17, we're going to begin with slide number 15, talking about who makes foreign policy. The constitutional powers of the president. The president is the commander in chief. So when war has been declared by Congress, the president can then, again, command the troops, send them into that theater of battle and decide different things and work with his defense department and the various generals to make war-making policy. A president can obviously sign treaties and executive agreements with foreign nations and things of that nature. Okay, so that's kind of what the president generally does, the constitutional powers. The Congress then serves as a balance to the presidency. Obviously, the Congress basically votes to go to war, okay, can formally declare war. The Senate ratifies the treaty that the president signs. The Congress also controls the power of the purse, so it can limit the scope of war if Congress decides to cut off funding. Again, that's a very difficult thing to do, though, once you've got troops committed into combat. If you cut off their funding midstream and leading to, hundreds or thousands or more of casualties, you can imagine how that goes down on the home front, okay? There's also something called the War Powers Resolution that effectively limits the power of a president to commit troops to war. This was signed in the 70s by Congress to limit, again, after Vietnam, the nation was very, very leery of presidents committing troops. Again, you had the initial phases of this under Kennedy, and then to a great degree under Johnson, and then Nixon inherited it from Johnson. And so you had troops committed in combat that was not under a declaration of war by Congress. So the War Powers Resolution limited, in other words, it enabled a president to commit troops, but within 60 days, that committal of troops needed to be agreed upon by Congress, or that committal of troops would need to be removed. So in other words, it was an attempt that even as presidents are committing troops into battle outside of a congressional declaration of war, it was an attempt to limit that, so you wouldn't have a Vietnam 2.0 kind of a scenario. If you go to the next slide number 16, who makes foreign policy? Other foreign policy making, the Department of State engages in, again, relations with other nations and basically functions as the foreign policy arm of the presidency to negotiate things before it gets to the presidential level. You've got the National Security Council that obviously deals with issues involving, national defense. You have the intelligence community, again, spies and things of that nature, surveillance, electronic surveillance, and so on and so forth. Again, intelligence gathering, trying to find out what is going on before we commit troops and things like that. And then, of course, the Department of Defense, which is, again, over the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. So the chief instruments, going to slide number 17, of national security policy that differ from domestic policy. Again, domestic policy is things like fiscal policy, right? Taxing and spending, or monetary policy, dealing with the Federal Reserve System, raising and lowering interest rates. National security policy involves four unique components, okay? The first is diplomacy, okay? This idea of negotiating between countries. In other words, make sure you're talking with other countries before you start lobbing missiles at them, okay? And the Department of State is the lead agency that gets this thing done, okay? Very, very important, obviously. You want to make sure you've got talks and communication going on between you and other nations. Military power, number two, obviously the Department of Defense, again, the control of the U.S. military. The third aspect of national security policy is intelligence gathering. Again, monitoring other countries' activity, the CIA, the National Security Administration, okay, the NSA. And then four, economic exchange, okay, dealing with international trade. In other words, the fun part of foreign policy is war, right? The war-making part of it. But these others, diplomacy, making sure there's communication going on. Finding out what your enemy is doing, economic exchange, making sure you can trade with them, or if this side of actual war, you can engage in what is called some forms of coercive diplomacy, where you can impose sanctions on another country, stop trading with them, stop shipping them goods that they critically need. Does that coerce them perhaps to do something they should do? That's exactly what we do with North Korea. All right, trying to coerce them to let go of their nuclear program, things of that nature. So those are the different aspects of national security policy. Moving on to slide number 18, the Cold War and its lessons. This idea that basically, is it important for us to get involved in every single area where communism is growing throughout the world? Again, we can look at it today and go, what were they thinking? Oh my gosh, we needlessly got involved in the Korean War. We needlessly got involved in Vietnam. But again, you have to remember, if you're trying to understand history, if you're trying to understand what is going on in politics, you have to disengage from what I call presentism or chronological snobbery, the thinking that we see things better from today's perspective than the perspective of the Americans in 1952 or the perspective of the Americans in 1964. I know hindsight is always 20/20, but you have to understand by going into the situation, going into that historical era and beginning to understand what was going on. All right, and we have what's called lessons of Vietnam. Never get involved in a land war in Asia. Right? Don't get involved. America is really good at fighting conventional war. We're really good at sending tanks against other tanks. We're really good at sending, planes against other planes and ships against other ships. But when you're fighting a guerrilla war in a jungle area, suddenly now, guerrilla fighters have an unstated advantage against us. Okay, so those are some of the challenges. Another challenge of the Cold War in Vietnam in particular is, don't engage in a war unless it's been formally declared by Congress, things of that nature. If you go to slide number 19, okay, there were shifts that happened as the Cold War was ending, and in particular, as the Vietnam conflict was basically playing itself out. President Nixon basically said, listen, America is not going to function as the world's Lone Ranger or the world's policeman to get involved in all of these areas of the world where communism is growing. In the 1980s, Russia was basically collapsing internally. Its economic system was not able to keep up with its military. All right, so even as it was trying to go toe-to-toe with the United States in armaments, in ICBMs, and all kinds of other military weaponry, its people were either starving or its economic system was basically falling apart. And so what President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union did is he tried to restructure Russian society, engaged in what was called perestroika. He was trying to engage in some free market initiatives that he hoped would get the Soviet economy going so that it wouldn't collapse. But ultimately it did collapse. Ultimately it was the foundation of that system was not strong. And so basically you went from, in the Cold War, what was called a bipolar world, two dominant countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, to, in the 1990s, you had what was called a unipolar world, or America's unipolar moment, where the United States was the unrivaled, superpower. If you go to slide number 20, you can see where, as a result of that, where the United States was the lone superpower, Bush 41 actually called for a new world order where the United States would kind of be the lead dog, the lead nation, but he wanted to embrace something called multilateralism, okay, the idea that major nations would act together in response to a problem. And again, the textbook example of that was the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And so in order to dislodge Saddam from Kuwait, President Bush in the United States basically got a coalition of multiple countries within the UN system this idea of multilateralism and the idea that we're going to engage in military force multilaterally. In other words, when you act in a multilateral way in foreign policy, you've got basically a greater chance of world consensus on your side. You've got a greater chance of nations going, yeah, let's do this. Okay, in other words, it reflects this is what the world wants to do. So you're not seen as this colonial belligerent going over there trying like a cowboy trying to kind of make something happen. Okay, so that's this idea of multilateralism. Multilateralism was seen in the 1990s. If you go to slide number 21, in the air wars in Kosovo. In the Balkans area there, where basically the United States got involved over there in Bosnia and Serbia and that war, trying to get other nations involved. Okay, and again, a lot of that war was fought, at least as the United States was concerned and as NATO was concerned, basically with precision military strikes from aircraft in the sky. We didn't get involved in ground troops. Okay, there were some ground troops there, but a lot of that was American air power in action there. And so the challenge there, the thinking, again, part of the problem with Kosovo is we didn't commit a lot of troops there. And because there was not ground troops moving in, it's a lot harder to dislodge an enemy. Again, the thinking of a lot of the strategists there was, listen, we can politically save face if no Americans are showing up dead in newspaper articles if we can just fight from the air. But the problem is that multilateralism was largely ineffective there. And part of the problem in Kosovo and part of the problem you'll see in Iraq is failing to deal with the religious dimension of man. Regardless of where your background is, whether you have a strong religious background or not as strong, the challenge in Kosovo was this idea of genocide, of systematically trying to kill Muslims, and how do you deal with that? One of the great challenges of war is not just going into a war zone, but then once war is over, how do you obtain justice? How do you obtain lasting peace? What is justice after war? How do you reconcile warring factions? In the case of Kosovo, you had systematic genocide of thousands and thousands and thousands of Muslims. It's still not resolved today. It's a big problem. Moving on to the Iraq War, after September 11th, the Americans, obviously the United States wanted to deal with terrorism. Wanted to deal with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Were there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Were there not? The United States made the assertion that there were. They had satellite evidence of it. It was brought up by Colin Powell in multiple United Nations speeches. Okay. Did it sell the international community like Bush 41 sold it in 1990? No. So you had more of a unilateral kind of a war in the Iraq War in 2003 and beyond. In other words, where the United States was basically the main combatant. You did not have a lot of other, Great Britain helped us, and I believe the Australians did, and there were some other countries, but a lot of countries did not. And so that would be an example of unilateralism, where one country goes in against another state. Another new aspect of warfare that occurred in Iraq was this idea of preemptive war, and not just Iraq, but the war on terror in Afghanistan. Again, finding out of Osama bin Laden and his terror networks, his Al-Qaeda terror networks in Afghanistan. So the logic that President Bush 43 proposed was this idea of preemptive war. In other words, where is it better to fight terrorists? In New York, in Washington, in Benton Harbor, in Berrien County, in Allegan County, or is it far better to fight them over in basically where they're set up shop, or where they're doing business? And so they engage in something called preemptive warfare. Again, this idea that we'll take preemptive action. We're not going to wait to get attacked. We're going to attack a country. Okay, and can you do that under the UN Charter? The answer is yes. There is legitimate cause there that if the United States, if any country sees an imminent attack coming it can engage in preemptive warfare. So it's not like it was in violation of the UN. Was it somewhat controversial? Yes, but again, the logic was better to fight them there than here. Okay, so I'm going to close with that, and I'll resume with slide number 23 next.